Hello, this is the Philosophical Rebellion Substack. We recently got reports that OPEC had been conspiring with United States-based companies to reduce the supply of oil, that way prices would be increased. That means American-based companies have been engaged in price fixing in order to raise prices on American consumers, while at the same time, think tanks and lobbyists aligned with big oil companies have been spreading the false claim that gas prices are being raised on American consumers because oil companies are not given enough contracts to drill on federal land. So right now we have an issue with big oil deceptively framing their price-fixing campaign as a war on American energy launched by the Biden administration. And in the wake of one of the best years for labor unions in the United States in decades, billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are actually taking on the constitutionality of the National Labor Relations Board, because those billionaires are sick of big government getting in the way of their exploitation of workers. So the billionaire class is claiming to fight for economic freedom while at the same time fighting against the ability of the American government to prevent union busting in America's largest and most powerful corporations. And for the last few years that the media has been obsessed with inflation, they've also failed to point out that the main cause of rising prices for American consumers is not true inflation, but is instead rising profit margins for America's largest corporations. And according to a Rand Corporation analysis looking at incomes going back to the 1970s, the incomes of the top 1% grew dramatically, with shareholders and corporate executives of America's mainstream corporations never having it so good. But at the same time, wages for most workers in America stagnated. And because of that redistribution of incomes away from workers to the elites, that results in about $42,000 of lost income per worker in the United States. Income which now instead goes to the 1% through the form of increased dividends to shareholders or compensation for corporate executives. And through that time, while the 1% were taking in more and more of the American economy, they were paying a lower and lower tax rate. So now the effective tax rate for the billionaire class is lower than for the median income American. And it has been extremely common for corporations with billions of dollars in profit to not pay any taxes, sometimes even getting tax rebates on billions of dollars in profit. So today, the working class makes less money and pays higher taxes so that the billionaire class can keep more. And not only that, with the money the working class actually gets to keep, they are then being price gouged by corporations who have achieved pricing power, which is investor speak for being a monopoly. And the way those corporations have achieved that monopoly status is through the decades-long erosion of government oversight of our economy. So although we have regulations to do things like make sure that your door doesn't fall off your flight, we have also told corporations like Boeing to enforce those regulations on themselves, which has led to a situation with a lot of doors flying off planes. But even the regulations we have written are no longer written with the best interest of the public in mind, but are instead written by the corporations themselves and the lobbyists that they hire in order to maximize their ability to price gouge the American consumer. And that has been brought about through Supreme Court decisions like that in Citizens United, where the Supreme Court gave corporations human status under our Constitution and said that corporations are entitled to human rights. And one of those rights is to have political representation. And that one of the forms of protected speech that corporations are entitled to are unlimited campaign donations to any political candidate they want. So what continues to happen in the American political system is that whenever you have a candidate in a primary election that threatens the big and powerful moneyed interests, those elites then go and fund a primary challenge so that when the general election comes around, it doesn't matter if a Republican or Democrat wins because both candidates end up being funded by and supporting the interests of the economic elites. So right now, we have a bunch of issues in the American political and economic systems that are connected. And I think the ideology and policy proposals of Bernie Sanders are absolutely vital to fix the American economy, starting with his Saving American Democracy constitutional amendment. And that amendment is designed to end the political activity of corporations and make it clear that corporations are not people and are not entitled to human rights under our Constitution. And that is not a new idea either. Theodore Roosevelt advocated for the same thing just over 100 years ago when he said that the Constitution does not grant the right of suffrage to any corporation. Then went further to say, there can be no effective control of corporations while their political activity remains. To put an end to it will be neither a short nor easy task, but it can be done. Then went on to say, corporate expenditures for political purposes have supplied one of the principal sources of corruption in our political affairs. And that comes from a Theodore Roosevelt speech called New Nationalism, in which he advocated for using government to regulate the excesses of capitalism. And in addition to regulating the political activity of corporations, Theodore Roosevelt also advocated for the unionization of the working class, a minimum wage as a living wage, for the right of government to regulate the use of wealth in the public interest, as well as the right to regulate the terms and conditions of labor, and a concept called the Square Deal, where he said that in addition to government enforcing the rules of our economy, we also need to change the rules of our economy to establish a more substantial equality of opportunity. And Theodore Roosevelt said that one of the central conditions of progress in human civilization is in the perpetual struggle between those who possess more than they have earned versus those who have earned far more than they possess. And with that in mind, Theodore Roosevelt advocated for an inheritance tax, because we live in a world with aristocrats or economic elites continuing to hoard all of their wealth and pass it down generation to generation. And the biggest entitlement of all is being given a massive fortune for being born into the right family. And the most entitled people of all are the ones born into extreme wealth who think that their wealth is a product of hard work. Because there are millions of people who work extremely hard and have very little wealth. But there are also elites who have tremendous wealth with very little work put in to earn it. Exemplified by the fact that all billionaires under 30 years old today inherited their wealth. So inside of America, we need new economic laws to establish a more reasonable income and wealth distribution so that the economic elites do not keep so much at the expense of the working class. And we also need to get rid of unfair economic participation, where corporations price gouge and monopolize a market, or send out knowingly defective equipment on planes, or derail a train and poison an entire city, because they prioritize profit above everything else. And we've weakened our government so much that there's nobody to step in on behalf of our citizens to take on the greed of the economic elites. So now when it comes to American economic policy, there is an enforced Overton window in which you can either be a naive libertarian who just wants to get rid of government altogether and let corporations and private power do whatever they want on one end of the Overton window. Then on the other end of the Overton window, you have government policy written by corporations to represent their interess. But if you move outside of that Overton window, that's where someone like Bernie Sanders and his economic ideology exist. And his economic ideology is actually very similar to Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism, in which government is not the enemy of the working class or the consumers or even corporations, but government is supposed to be used to enforce fair economic practices and make sure that workers and consumers are not being taken advantage of by the economic elites. One of the main forms of propaganda forced onto America from the corporate class is that government is your enemy, when in reality, government is your representative to make sure that those corporations and those billionaires and those powerful private interests do not take advantage of you. So we need to end the political reign of corporations and billionaires and big-moneyed interests buying our political representatives and shaping their political priorities. Then we need a new era of economic policy which establishes a more substantial equality of opportunity, while also ridding our economy of unfair economic practices which corporate America loves to engage in. So it is time for America to reinvigorate the labor movement and create a truly fair economic system that represents the economic interests of all Americans, not just those in the top 1%. But right now, there are economic elites who have it so much better in this current system just because you have it worse. And they will fight with everything they have to make sure that they continue having a corrupted system benefiting their own interests, instead of creating a fair system that works to represent everyone's interests. And those are the billionaires. Those are the corporate lobbyists that have tremendous power in the American political system. So I think people should be putting a lot of their energy into telling their political representatives on both the state and federal levels that they want to end the political activity of corporations, and they want to take away the political power lobbyists have in Washington, D.C. It is not an easy or quick fight taking on political and economic corruption, but it is an absolutely necessary and vital fight for the American people to have, because we need to restore citizen control over our government. And the most important tool to accomplish that is Bernie Sanders' Saving American Democracy constitutional amendment.